Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. I thought we would go live here. Um, Bitcoin is right around 78K, a little less than 78K. But a lot of stuff's happened recently. And some of the longer term views are finally starting to play out. Obviously, ETH going home. I think one of the final steps will be alt Bitcoin pairs go to the range lows. So I mean, it's kind of one of those things where it's taken longer for that stuff to play out, which is causing, a lot of people to believe it's not going to happen. But I mean, in my experience, it does eventually happen. It's just some cycles it happens earlier than other cycles. And this cycle, it's happening much later in the cycle than it normally does. Um, so let's talk about where the market is, what's really going on. So let me share my screen. All right. So Bitcoin right now, just above 77K, about 77 and a half. Let me switch this over to because these candles are looking kind of weird on this one. Um, so right now, Bitcoin is still above the 2024 high. That is going to be, the bull's defense, honestly. The 2024 high would be somewhat symbolic of the 2016 high. Now, of course, there's the discussion about right translated and left translated. But from just a technical perspective, testing the high from the prior year was always a likely outcome. You can see that, well, that was, I guess, I was looking at this is the 2016 testing the 2015 high. And then in 2017, we tested the 2016 high. So that is going to be the sort of that first level of defense for the bulls. And I've often said that we could see Bitcoin go as low as the prior high and still from a technical perspective be okay. Um I would and one of the ways to kind of like visualize that is if you go look at peak to peak ROI after cycle peak, and you go peak to peak and you look at this cycle compared to the 2016 2017 cycle. At this point in the 2017 cycle, Bitcoin was basically at its prior all-time high. So what that means is that Bitcoin could right now be at 69K, and this chart would match the 2017 chart in terms of ROI from the last peak. That's how far ahead this cycle has in fact been. So that's one consideration. The prior high will be sort of the first line of defense for the bulls. There's something else that's really important that's happening right now in the cryptoverse, and it can be extremely, extremely easy to miss it if you're not paying attention to what's going on. And what that is the devaluation of alt Bitcoin pairs, starting with ETH Bitcoin, right? Starting with ETH Bitcoin, the devaluation of alt Bitcoin pairs, starting with ETH Bitcoin. Now, this is important. All right. This is really important. And I don't want people misunderstanding what I'm saying because I've honestly, sometimes I struggle communicating certain ideas, but ETH going home has never been one of them. What did we talk about for years? For years. Don't forget it now, right? I mean, don't forget it now when it matters. What we have gone on and on and on about is that when ETH USD breaks support during the quantitative tightening phase of the cycle, which is where we still are right now. I understand a lot of people gave up on this a long time ago. I did not. When it breaks down from the higher low structure during quantitative tightening, okay, we'll overlay it with the Federal Reserve. right? Assets held by the Fed. This is where things start to get interesting from a Bitcoin dominance perspective. Now, in the short term, Bitcoin dominance should go up. Right now, it's at 62%. I think it could easily go back up to 64. It could go to 66. There does exist a chance it could go higher than that, but there's an important nuance to this chart, and say this with me, right? There is a difference between alt Bitcoin pairs and alt USD pairs, right? There's a difference between them. Alt Bitcoin pairs are not equivalent to alt USD pairs. So if you're going to stick around on this channel, you need to understand the difference. If you don't understand the difference and you stick around on this channel, the analysis that I do is likely going to infuriate you. Okay? If you value your portfolio in Satoshis, you're going to have no problem with this channel. If you value it in US dollars and you're just looking for any reason to say that some altcoins up 10% when Bitcoin went up like 300% over a couple of years or even more, that's when we have issues. Okay? But here's the thing. Forget about everything going on in the macro for a minute. Obviously, the macro doesn't look great. No one's trying to hide behind that. We understand we have an uninverted yield curve. Okay? We know that when you have a new presidential administration during high inflation and unemployment, it can lead to all sorts of different cyclical behavior, right? We know that. Just for 1 minute, let's forget about all the macro stuff. Let's assume that everything is on the chart. I don't need to know how many times they decided to put tariffs on and take them off today, right? Probably 10 times. Let's just pretend like none of that stuff matters for a minute, all right? All I want to do is say, all right, we've got a chart in front of us. We've got ETH USD on that chart, and we have the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve, right? Here's the thing. We don't even need the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve on this chart to make sense of it all. We don't need it. It's convenient, admittedly. It helped me tell the story that I wanted to tell to help people understand the importance of Bitcoin dominance. So it served me well. And, if you overlay ETH Bitcoin onto the chart, there is no denying that last cycle ETH Bitcoin bottomed when quantitative tightening was over. That's when it bottomed. It did not bottom a month before. Did not bottom 3 months later. Everyone who tried to front run the bottom on ETH Bitcoin got left behind by the market to the downside, right? And even this cycle, how many times have you heard people calling for Altseason? Just a couple of weeks ago, how many gurus on Twitter were there telling you that Altseason was around the corner and you shouldn't wait for QE? I'm not saying you should wait for QE, but until QT is over, alt Bitcoin pair is likely going to bleed. But let's go back to what I said. Let's suppose that that's not important. The balance sheet of the Fed. Let's just say it's not important. How could you look at this chart and make a conclusion about something? Well, this is what we could conclude. This is what we could say just by looking at this chart. We could say that as long as ETH USD held support in the Bitcoin dominance uptrend of 2018 and 2019, ETH Bitcoin continued to bleed. It wasn't until about 1 month after ETH USD broke down that ETH Bitcoin bottomed. Now, I can look at that chart and I don't need to know what the Fed was doing. I didn't need to know, what the size of their balance sheet was at. I didn't need to know what interest rates were at. All I had to know was that Bitcoin dominance was sure as hell going to go up until ETH USD broke down. Same thing this cycle, right? Did you need to know the Fed was increasing their balance sheet? It's a good narrative, and I think it really helped a lot of people the way I explained it. But as long as, as long as ETH USD is holding support in a Bitcoin dominance uptrend, the sobering reality that's hard for people to accept is that as long as ETH USD holds support, then ETH Bitcoin bleeds. It's as simple as that, right? It's not any more complicated than that. As long as ETH USD holds support, ETH Bitcoin bleeds. Therefore, Bitcoin dominance goes up. So how do you flip the script, right? How do you flip the script? If ETH USD going up in a Bitcoin dominance uptrend means ETH Bitcoin bleeds, well, how do you get ETH Bitcoin to go up? Well, as I said, ETH has to go where no one wants it to go. It has to go home. Until it does that, ETH Bitcoin bleeds, right? I mean, and that's exactly what happened last cycle. ETH Bitcoin bled until ETH went home into the lower regression band. Now, last cycle when ETH Bitcoin bottomed, it was on the first green weekly candle after ETH USD entered the lower regression band. Now, it also corresponded to QT ending and back then QE beginning, but that's where ETH Bitcoin bottomed. So, and this kind of goes back to this thing we've talked about for years, right? In order for Bitcoin dominance to top, monetary policy has to change. But in order for monetary policy to have to change, there's got to be pain, right? I mean, as long as there's not pain, what incentive does the Federal Reserve have to loosen up monetary policy? They don't, and they haven't, right? I mean, quantitative tightening has continued. I mean, yes, they cut interest rates by about 100 basis points. But remember, last cycle, when ETH Bitcoin started to turn around, it was after the Fed had cut 75 basis points. Back then, the terminal rate was only 250, right? This cycle, yes, they've cut 100, but the terminal rate was 550. So in order to equate these ratios, this 100 actually, I believe, if memory serves me correct, needs to be about 165 basis points. So you could argue that in order for it to mimic last cycle, the Fed would need to have another 65 basis points of rate cuts under their belt, which they don't have yet. That could explain it. I mean, I could explain it. With Bitcoin, 73 is the prior high. 73K. That's the prior high. Obviously, Bitcoin's well below the bull market's worth band now. And as I've said, and I've tried to be pretty clear about my view, there was always going to be some de-risking after January 20th. And we talked about this a lot, right? You had the pricing in of a strategic reserve. You had Gary Gensler resigning. You had deregulation. You basically had what a lot of people would consider perfection, the golden age of crypto, as they call it. The problem is when perfection is priced in and then you don't actually get all that stuff and things sort of fall short of what expectations were, meaning instead of getting a strategic reserve where the government's immediately buying Bitcoin, they just create a reserve with the Bitcoin they already have, right? Deregulation just meant presidents were going to launch meme coins. And that's kind of not what the industry needs right now, And so it always made sense to get some de-risking following January 20th. And, it's unfortunate that it does happen to line up with what a left translated cycle would be. But if you wanted to operate deterministically, which is something you really shouldn't do, and I tell you this from experience, right? It's not generally wise to operate deterministically. Sometimes if you have a very strong conviction about it, it makes sense. Like Bitcoin dominance, I think it made sense to be deterministic about that and the devaluation of all Bitcoin pairs, right? The altcoin reckoning. I'm happy I was deterministic about that. There are times when I'm deterministic about things and it really doesn't go my way. But again, as I've said, if you wanted to operate deterministically about this, to have some form of clarity on what the market is trying to tell you, I would say that if you want the cycle to continue, Bitcoin need not go much below the prior high, right? I'm not saying it can't wick below it. I mean, it did in 2017, right? You got a very brief wick below the 2016 high. So I don't want to sit here and say that like it can't go below it. But the counterpoint is back then when it went below it, it actually held the bull market support band at support. Now it's actually below that level. It's below it. So it doesn't have that same support level to really hold. And there is a risk that this is, in fact, a left translated cycle. Doesn't really matter if you like it. Doesn't matter if I like it. Doesn't really matter who likes it. Market doesn't care what anyone likes. It's just going to do what it's going to do, regardless of your opinion, my opinion, your feelings, my feelings. It doesn't matter. My point, though, is to maintain a somewhat decent market structure, you would want to see Bitcoin hold 73K as support. I'm not saying it can't wick below it, but I will say this again. If Bitcoin goes all the way down into the 60s, especially the low 60s, if it goes all the way down here, it would be very hard not to operate deterministically for me at that point. Meaning, my expectation would be that if it goes down here, it would get a counter trend rally in Q2, Q3, and then ultimately resolve to a lower high, and then the cycle's over. So you don't want to see it go into the low 60s. I know a lot of people are like, from a TA perspective, are like, well, yeah, it could retest this. Well, sure it could, and I believe it very well may. But if it does, you would probably get a bounce, but it probably wouldn't be the bounce you want, right? It would probably just be sort of a lower high. Because you have to remember, like when the QQQ got that drop around the same time of the year. Now, it wasn't an election year, not a post-election year. But when the QQQ got that same type of drop after it rallied for 54 weeks, it dropped all the way down to 63. And it had a hell of a counter trend rally from April until August. But it was just a lower high. It was just a lower high. So that's why I'm saying it's actually really important how low Bitcoin goes in order to understand what type of rally would come on the other side of that drop, whether it's just a counter trend rally that resolves to a lower high or something that can actually lead to a higher high. And that, I think, is what we're in the process of finding out. Now, the question is well, how much longer does this have to go on for? I mean, hell, Bitcoin's been dropping basically nonstop since inauguration. I mean, look at these 2-week candles. Inauguration for the new administration was right here, January 20th, when this 2-week candle began. So ever since the quote unquote golden age of crypto began, every 2-week candle by Bitcoin has in fact been red. I don't control what it is. You don't control what it is. It just is what it is. And we got to make sense of what it is, right? Well, this is what the chart is showing us. So in this case, right, I think one of the things to consider is a lot of what we talked about with, seasonality. Okay. Now, with seasonality in post-election years, it is very common to have a bad January and a bad March. Okay. Very common. In fact, if you look at the S&P 500 year-to-date ROI in 2025, and you compare it to the average of all prior post-election years, you can see that on average, the S&P 500 year-to-date ROI is still around 1 at day 100, 3 months into the year. So that's 3 months where the market's generally not going up. In fact, if you look at Bitcoin, just Bitcoin alone, and you look at 2025 and compare it to 2017, you can see that even in 2017, Bitcoin was actually around this same price, about 3 months, or the same ROI, not price, same ROI, about 3 months into the year. By the way, guys, if you're not subscribed, subscribe, give the video a thumbs up. I'm not even going to check the amount of likes that we have. I'm sure you guys have gotten it over 1,000 likes. There's no way. I can't imagine there's 7,000 people sitting here without 1,000 likes. I just can't even imagine it. But just like a lot of people can't imagine ETH going home. The thing that is slightly different between 2017 and 2025 is that in 2017, Bitcoin didn't really do that well in January and March, but it did okay in February. This year, there wasn't really any strength in February either. So the downtrend, the weakness in March is sort of pronouncing the weakness in January even more, because there wasn't really anything to level us back up in February. It's basically just been down only. So then when would we expect to see some renewed strength? Well, let's just say let's not worry about whether the cycle's over or not for a minute. When would there be some relief if history is any indication? Well, there's two things I would say. From a seasonality perspective, it's probably not going to happen until the first quarter of the year is over. Okay? And I've been pretty clear about this. I would not expect anything to change through Q1. If you guys remember, in late February, I said that we're likely going to see a risk-off environment between February options expiration and March options expiration. And March options expiration is still a little less than 2 weeks away. So, with that said, I don't really expect any sustained strength by risk assets until after March options expiration, which is basically going to get you most of the way through March. There's going to be one more week in March where it, maybe the market it bounces there, but I'm sort of guessing at this point you're going to see weakness through March options expiration, and you might see that weakness persist through April labor market data. That's what I'm thinking. Remember, the QQQ didn't really see renewed strength until April, I believe, back then. And the seasonality, right? Just post-election year seasonality, we don't really see much going on until the second quarter of the year, regardless of whether there's a recession or not. You might argue that the reason there hasn't been more strength in February is precisely because of recession fears, right? Maybe that's the reason why February of 2025 was a lot worse than February of 2017, because in 2017, we didn't have an inverted yield curve or an uninverted yield curve recently, from a recently inverted yield curve. We didn't have all that. So maybe that explains some of that weakness. But, in the short term, I think the processes that we have talked about for years are in fact playing out. One of those processes is ETH going home. ETH going home. This process, something many believed would never happen, it's now happening. The other process that hasn't yet, it's pretty apparent now that ETH is in fact in the regression band, right? It's pretty obvious now. Like, we can't just pretend like it's not. And so that theory has sort of come to pass. Certainly it could fall deeper into the regression band, and if history is an indication, it probably will. The fair value is around 15 to 1600, right? So if it goes there, that's arguably home. The basement is around 1000 to 1200 of that house, the basement of that house. But in this case, there's another theory that we've talked about a lot, and it hasn't played out. Not yet. But I do believe it will. And that is the alt Bitcoin pairs. The altcoin chart on their Bitcoin pairs still remains approximately 35% off the range low. That's a lot off the range low. I've been in crypto a long time, and I don't believe that altcoins are anything better than oscillators against Bitcoin at best. Not at worst, at best. So your favorite altcoin, there's a really good chance that over a long enough period of time, it's an oscillator at best and a bleeder at worst. That's the way the way the Cryptoverse works, right? I don't control it. I just enforce it. I want other people to realize this is what's happening. So it's taken a long time for ETH Bitcoin to get to where it is. It's taken a long time for ETH USD to go home. It still happened. All Bitcoin pairs still well above the range lows of 0.25. A lot of people say it's not going to happen just because it hasn't happened yet. But I think it still will. I think it still will. I think alt Bitcoin pairs will, in fact, go to the range lows. The crazy reality of this cycle is that the altcoin reckoning never ended. And you know how we have proof of that? The advanced decline index of the top 100 cryptocurrencies just put in a new cycle low. It's been trending down since November of 2021. The altcoin reckoning never actually ended. And I've been telling people this for 3 years. It never actually ended. And the reason it never ended was because quantitative tightening never ended. Alt Bitcoin pairs just keep going lower. I know that's been offensive to people. I get it. I've been in that situation before. But until QT ends, that's probably the most likely outcome, is that all Bitcoin pairs just continue to bleed. Now, we have another Fed meeting in March. I believe it's a little over a week from today. Here we go. Next Fed meeting, March 19th. Okay, March 19th. So it's 9 days from now. So I guess next Wednesday. Could they end quantitative tightening in March? It's possible. I mean, Powell said that reserves are ample. And if you read the FOMC minutes, which I'm sure everyone listening did that, if you read FOMC minutes, basically the sort of the median projection is that they'll end quantitative tightening about mid-year. If the markets continue to sell off like this for the next week, you could argue that they might end QT sooner, right? The problem that I have is that all Bitcoin pairs are still at 0.38. If they were at 0.25 right now, I'd be like, yeah, the Fed's going to end QT in March. But because they're not, I don't know. I mean, yeah, there has been some pain recently, but I don't know if there's been enough to cause the Fed to pivot just yet. Note that when alt Bitcoin pairs do go down, they can go down pretty quick. I mean, like if you look at this weekly candle right there, alt Bitcoin pairs dropped 16% basically. So for instance, if alt Bitcoin pairs were to drop 16%, that'll put them at 0.32, right? And then another, 17, 18% from there basically gets them to the range lows. So it's not impossible for that to happen, but it is the ultimate outcome. It is the most likely outcome that alt Bitcoin pairs go down here. The same way that the most likely outcome for Ethereum was for it to eventually go home, and now it's finally in that process. The eventual outcome, I think, for all Bitcoin pairs is they go to the range lows. I don't know. I can't tell you what hour it's going to happen. I can't tell you what day, what week, what month. I don't know exactly. It's more of a process that I think has to play out. And that's the thing about the Cryptoverse is you want to focus on what is the process that needs to play out for the market to actually be healthy again. And I think that's the process, right? I think it's all Bitcoin pairs going to the range lows is what needs to ultimately play out. But because it's taking so long, a lot of people just give up on the idea. And the thing is more people give up on it, the longer it takes, because then those people that give up, then they go buy altcoins. It sort of just makes the process take longer and longer and longer. And then once everyone's sort of capitulated into the altcoin market, then it all happens. Once no one's left to buy, right? So I think that, with Ethereum, it's getting pretty close to that sort of that fair value logarithmic regression trend line. Remember in 2019, as it came down here, it sort of, and this is basically a 10x move, right? This is 10x that. This right here is 10x this, and so on and so forth. This low right there was around 150, 160. So maybe that'll correspond to 1500, 1600. which would actually put ETH right around its home before some type of pivot. Um, that's what I'm looking for. We'll see though. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, right? I don't know. I don't know what's gonna happen, but um with the S&P, I mean, it's obviously taken a hit recently. And I also think it looks somewhat similar to the S&P divided by M2 in 1998, right? It got a rejection off this same level right here. And it had a pretty swift move down and then another crazy expansion into like this massive distribution phase that led into the dot-com crash. But that's where it is right now, right? It went to the same level that it was at in August of 1998. Which I mean is interesting. It's an interesting way to sort of think about the S&P divided by the money supply. And I mean, I think that's the weakness that ultimately the Fed won't be able to ignore forever. To some degree, if you're Trump, you probably need asset prices to come down for at least a little while. And the reason for that is because when asset prices come down, it actually helps to cure the inflation issue. And I think this cycle, it's like there's been a lot of pressure to basically sort of get inflation under control without having a market-wide pullback. But in reality, getting these pullbacks can actually help a lot with solving the inflation problem. There's no guarantee right now that we have to repeat the 1970s where we just get, back-to-back left translated cycles because inflation comes back. There's no guarantee that happens. I would like to think that we will learn from our mistakes of the 1970s. I don't know if we will, but I want to be optimistic. I want to be optimistic and hope that we learn from those mistakes and that we don't have to go through another wave of inflation. One of the ways that we can avoid another wave of inflation is by having some pain for a little while with risk assets. As crazy as that sounds, I mean, like, if you want lower prices, right? I mean, Trump did say he would lower prices. Here they are, right? Bitcoin's at 78K. It's hard to lower price. I mean, it's hard to get inflation under control without lowering risk assets. You lower risk assets, it reduces spending and therefore reduces inflation and thereby gets us back into a more normal looking economy. So the process, while it can be difficult, I mean, you can just look at US inflation rate year over year. I mean, you can look at it and kind of just see that, these green shaded regions, you get economic downturns a lot of times to get inflation under control. It's not that unheard of. It's a process. We go through the process, and then we move on with our lives, right? If anything, it just creates opportunities for those who are willing to stick around. If you're not willing to stick around, then I'll see you next cycle at the peak. But if you are willing to stick around, then it can lead to opportunities. I think the hard part right now that a lot of people are sort of grappling with is that it for the cycle, or will there be more? And that's ultimately something that we won't. I mean, yes, you can pick a side. Obviously, you can pick one side or the other. Um, it's not like I'm necessarily optimistic after what I saw happen at the top with all these presidents launching meme coins, you know. Um, but at the same time, like I don't think the market will definitively have an answer for you until the third or fourth quarter of the year. Okay. And there still would likely be money to be made in that time as long as you're willing to trade what could just be counter trend rallies. Um, but hopefully the market can eventually pick back up. But if it doesn't, then it would in fact be Bitcoin's first left translated cycle. Right. So again, it's hard to say exact probabilities for that. If Bitcoin were to go into the low 60s, I would say the probability of a left translated cycle is quite high. As long as it's above the 2024 high, you could still have a right translated cycle. How do you navigate something like that? Well, as I said a few weeks ago, having some cash on hand in case you do get this big drop, which we're actually getting right now. That way you can actually take advantage of it. If you don't have any cash, right, then you obviously can't do that. And that's the reason why we sort of talk about those modern portfolio theory tools and, where on the efficient frontier do you really want to be? How much risk do you want to take on? And, I do think that times like this can actually get us back to a more sensible market. You probably watched this cycle. A lot of cryptocurrencies really underperform. I think a lot of it was due to misallocation of capital, a lot of misallocation of capital to the meme coin market. And sometimes when you have a significant misallocation of capital, the market has to punish those investors. And unfortunately, it can punish other investors too that are not focusing on that stuff. But it's sort of like a necessary evil to get that crap out of the market. So that's just the way the market works. You sometimes have these pullbacks that allow that crap to get out, and then ultimately the market is stronger for it. Some of the downturns last longer than others. My guess is that you will not find any durable strength by risk assets until after options expiration in March. I'm not saying it has to happen the very week after, but I don't really think you're going to see a durable turnaround until after that, which again, that's still a little less than 2 weeks away. That's my base case, and it's been my base case for a while now. So okay, make sure you guys subscribe. If you're not subscribed, give the video a thumbs up. You guys have any questions for me? All right. Can we link a Bitcoin rainbow chart? How's the 2.5 log line rule holding up? I think it's done okay. This cycle, it certainly didn't always feel like it was, but I think it's mostly tracking what it would normally track. I mean, you can see that. I mean, from this one, half and then 1, 2 puts you here. But if you take it from the first peak, that basically gets you to right there at that midpoint, which is where it sort of topped over there in March. So, I mean, like if the peak is not in, then by the end of the year, that would be closer to like 130, 140. But yeah, I mean, so far, the 2.5 log line rule hasn't really failed. Someone says CME gap at what? Shrewd Capital. CME gap at 87K, then back down. Let's take a look. I know there's actually a lot of if you look too far back, there's a lot of gaps, but yeah, it looks like there's one right here at around 87. You know what this kind of reminds me of to some degree. If this guy's right, I could see it happening, honestly. But the way it would work is I've wondered if this is kind of like what happened back over here in 2019 as we went into the end of quantitative tightening, where you sort of had like this double top, right? You kind of had like a double top right here, and then you had a drop below the bull market support band, kind of like what we're getting right now. And then eventually you actually had a rally back up to it. And so that could very well happen, right? Maybe you go down and then you get a rally back up to it to fill that gap, and then you come down again into the summer, and then maybe the Fed ends QT, right? Maybe that's how it'll play out. That's what happened in 2019, right? That's what happened in 2019 as the Fed ended quantitative tightening. You had sort of a rally back up to the 21-week EMA. And right now, the 21-week EMA is around 88K, almost 89K. And the CME gap is at around 87K right here. 87K. I mean, basically, we're right at 87K. 87,250 to be exact. So that's the gap they're talking about. And there's other gaps too. I mean, there's a gap here. Right, there's a gap right here from November that we just filled. Right, we just filled. There's also gaps previously as well. Not all of them have we filled. Like there's one right here that I don't really think we filled at like 48K. Are there any more? There's also one. I mean, there's one way over here that got filled. I believe are mostly filled at around 19, right? But you can see there was a gap and the market sort of came back down to mostly fill that gap. So that's essentially what, what they're referring to are these gaps. But look, a lot of times when this stuff plays out, it'll take place on sort of a multi-week time frame. And so what I'm wondering is, you will have relief at some point, generally speaking. I mean, unless there's an all out crash, you'll have relief at some point. And so if you get a counter trend rally, then it would probably look something like this, right? Where it sort of comes down, and then after March options expiration, it then goes back up to then fill that gap, and then potentially gets rejected at the bull market support band, and then goes down to a lower low, and then tries again, right? That's essentially what happened in 2019. That's what happened, right? Sort of down, sideways, up, down, sideways, and then it sort of broke through, and then you had the recession. So I could totally see that happening. Absolutely, that's one way for this ultimately to play out, is to fill that gap on the way down. I mean, the short term, I think people are really desperate for something different than just down only. I mean, Ethereum has basically just been down only since mid-December. I mean, the weekly RSI on this thing's got to be getting pretty low. I mean, it's at it's at 33. Um, Bitcoin's weekly is still probably kind of high right now. Yeah, it's only like 43. It's not as bad. Um, but if Bitcoin does go through that process of sort of a counter trend rally to fill the gap at 87K or 87,250, then one of the things you probably would see the devaluation of all Bitcoin pairs, because my guess would be that on a counter trend rally, Bitcoin dominance would go up because quantitative tightening has not actually ended. And it could be QT ending in March that leads to that counter trend rally. Because again, it was when quantitative tightening ended in September of 2019. Shortly after that, there was a counter trend rally back up to the bull market support band. So, you have to remember that it could all play out in a in a very familiar way. We'll see. We'll see. I mean, right now Bitcoin is still struggling, but I wonder where it is with respect to these daily moving averages. Actually, I mean, you have obviously like the 20-day and the 50-day, the 100-day, and then the 200-day. It looks like it's well below the 20-day and the 50-day. The 100-day is way up here, and it looks like it actually just fell below the 200-day. So it's been breaking down on a lot of these different time frames. If it does something like this, then it would get sort of a drop, and then another drop, a rally into a lower high, and then a deeper capitulation, kind of like what it did last year. I mean, if it does that, that would probably correspond to the Bank of Japan raising rates again. So the good news is the Bank of Japan basically just said they're not going to be raising rates at every meeting. So the implication is that they probably won't raise rates in March, but that doesn't mean they won't raise rates in like May or June. So it could do something like that where it sort of drops in, rallies up, fills the gap on the CME, goes down to a lower low, and then the Fed changes policy completely. All right, let's look at some other questions. Someone says they should have invested in eggs. Yeah, eggs did pretty well. What do I think will be the final trigger to start QE and rate cuts? Well, Powell said they're not going to start QE until interest rates are at zero. So I don't know if you want to take him at his word. Anyone who's faded his word so far has been wrong. I don't think you're going to get rate cuts anytime soon. I think if you get a 20% drop in the stock market, that might change some minds. But yeah, where someone says the fear and greed will be 10 tomorrow. Where is it? It's got to be kind of low now, right? Usually when you get these big drops, that's actually at 24. There's been a little bit of divergence here between the price and the fear and greed index, right? Fear and greed's been trending up while the price has been trending down. can be the end with a lot of people in this sphere. Look, man, it's tough to say. I feel like people have been saying the same thing for the last 2 months, right? Like, "Oh, there's so much fear." But, um, someone said they should have invested in gold. Gold's probably gonna do well for a little while. What percentage drop have we seen on the S&P over the last week? So, I think I mean, just over the last week, it's been well, this week today, it was 2.7%. From last week, from the weekly open last week to today, it was about 6% drop. Total, what we've seen from the top to the low is about a 9% drop. When this drop began, I was sort of thinking, and again, like you have to be careful with price targets because there's no way to know. But when we talked about the risk off time from February options expiration to March, I was thinking mentally, I was thinking around 5,500 was kind of like my mental target. And the reason I was thinking 55 was because that gets you to about a 10% drop. And we had a 10% drop over here, right? About a 10% drop. So and that was also when, yields were going higher. They're obviously not going higher anymore, but that was when yields were screaming higher. So I was generally thinking, like, all right, like around 5,500 seems like a reasonable drop. If it's more than that, if it's more than 10%, if it's 20%, then you get that S&P divided by M2 to go all the way back down to prior support. Right now, that would be even more brutal. That would be at 4,900, which actually happens to correspond to the prior all-time high of the S&P, basically. So the 5,500 was kind of where I was just mentally thinking that would be a good target. On the other side of March options expiration, if it's not lower than 5,500, the market would probably start to favor upside at that point as you get into April. Would be my guess. That doesn't mean that it couldn't just be a short-term counter trend rally that then goes lower into the summer, but that's what I'm thinking right now, right? And today it actually went into the 5,500 range. It went to 5,564. So it's actually it reached sort of my mental target 2 weeks before I think the window of weakness closes. So it's possible that it could go lower into that area. And I don't know exactly where it's going to find support. If you look at the daily time frame, you'll notice that a lot of these bounces that it's had, right there, it sort of swept that low on Friday and then got a bounce back up. And then a lot of people on Twitter were like, "Oh, that's the low, that's the low." And then today we just went lower. So then now you look at what's the next low that it might sweep, and if it goes below 5,500, I mean that gets you this low right there is 5,400, and then this low would put you at around 5,100. So my guess, and I guess you have this one too, at around a little less than 5,000. But those are the kind of the areas that you would want to watch for sort of a sweep of a low. So it would probably, if it corresponds to March options expiration. So March options is like right here, right? So basically what I'm saying is that I think there will be continued weakness until the market reaches this yellow line. I don't know how far it's going to drop before it hits that yellow line. That's the hard part. I don't know how far it's going to drop until it hits that. And it maybe it just sweeps that low. It could sweep that low. It's possible to sweep that low. That low would basically be that 20% drop, which would correspond to the S&P divided by M2 getting the same drop that I got in 1998. I don't know that that's my base case. Like I mean, I guess it's possible if all this macro stuff just keeps running these headlines and whatnot. I guess it's not completely out of the question, but the good news would be that if it dropped that much, it would probably lead to a big counter trend rally that actually could lead to a new high if it drops that low that quickly. Because then you'd have a ton of fear at that level if it were to go back down to that high that quickly. I don't know. I mean, a lot of times it's hard to call for that stuff because a lot of times the market will find support and it'll be a sort of a slower drop. But for me, my base case is just weakness in risk assets for a couple more weeks, probably some renewed strength in April until until we see how low Bitcoin goes. It's hard to know exactly how much higher it will climb. I do agree that you're likely going to see a rally back up to the bull market support band at some point, which would likely correspond to the high 80s. Um, but that doesn't have to be this week. Like I mean, it might not happen until next month. It might be a little while before something like that were to happen. But we'll see. I mean, I guess it could happen at any moment, but that's generally what I would think. If we look at Bitcoin on the daily, um, it's been kind of interesting because it tends to drop the most when the stock market opens, right? A lot, and that's kind of the thing is like that's what takes Bitcoin lower. It's not Bitcoin itself that's taking Bitcoin lower. A lot of times, just risk assets are selling off, and because risk assets in general are selling off, it's ultimately taking Bitcoin lower. Huh. Someone says a possibility that one of the three conditions doesn't meet: Bitcoin dominance above 60, ETH going home, but not alts going to the range lows. Uh, yeah, look, it's possible that prediction doesn't come true. I don't expect to get, I don't have a perfect track record, and it's possible that one is the one that will in fact be wrong. But that's my base case. Like I'm here to tell you what my base case is, and my base case is that all Bitcoin pairs go to the range lows. You may have noticed that all Bitcoin pairs have actually showed a little bit of strength so far in March, right? I mean, it doesn't completely go unnoticed that they're still at 0.38 despite all the carnage. But you have to remember that they also had some relative weak or relative strength last March as well. If anything, this March there's been less strength than last March. But I still think once you get into April and then June, I'm expecting new lows on all Bitcoin pairs in April and maybe even into June. Um, MT says the biggest moves up happen only about 8 to 10 days per year, just in the market hall and stuff. So there's a lot of truth to that, especially in the stock market, right? A lot of the gains, actually, a lot of the gains in the stock market happen overnight. It's kind of interesting. Remember, guys, make sure you subscribe if you're not subscribed and give the video a thumbs up. Uh, Someone says, from my understanding, we want alts to hit range lows. Once your survival go higher, the lower they go. Yeah, I mean, like the alts going to the range lows in their Bitcoin pair is a good thing for the market, not a bad. Um, what other questions are there? Let me scroll and see. What would happen to Bitcoin dominance if it's left translated? Um, Probably up until QT is over, and then it probably drops for a while. But it would drop as all USD pairs go down, but all Bitcoin pairs would go up. At this point, does it make sense to sell alts or just bear the pain? That's not really a question I can easily answer because it's going to depend on which alts. Not all alts will perform the same way. Um, in my first cycle or two, I sort of just treated it as tuition. It's like, all right, well, I learned my lesson. I just won't make the same mistakes in the future. A lot of times people ask these questions, right? I mean, it can lead to emotional trades. So I don't want you to feel like you need to go make an emotional trade and that you might regret it. But it's just important to be aware that these processes do play out each cycle. So it might be worthwhile to hold on to that lesson next cycle. Uh, ETH right now, let's see how low ETH has gone. So far, it's gone to 1753. That's getting pretty low. I mean, that's getting pretty low, honestly. Um, I'm thinking that I mean, I like it's hard to know exactly when it's going to bounce, but um, if you look at the regression band for Ethereum, I mean, if it follows what it did last cycle, it'll get a bounce at around 1600 back up to a little over 2K. Maybe it's like 2200 or something. You can see right here that's what it did, right? It came down and then went back up to the top of the regression band. So maybe it does the same thing. I mean, a lot of people keep asking about ADA, but I've been pretty clear about it. I mean, I just think it's mostly doing what it did last year. Last year it got a move up in December and then slowly bled out. And then this one is the same thing, right? A move in December and then slowly bled out. Main difference, I guess, is that it got this move up, which is kind of different than what happened last year. But presumably because of the the digital crypto stockpile or whatever they decided to call it. But again, until quantitative tightening is over, it's probably just going to bleed. Again, we'll talk about something else when QT ends, but it just hasn't ended yet. What do I think about alts in the alt season if it comes? Are we going to get something similar to 2021 or just well, this is already very different from 2021. In order to see anything remotely like 2021, you need to have QE, right? And we don't have that right now. The good news is that going through pain could eventually lead to something like that, but we don't have it right now. When do I think QT will end? I have no idea. I mean, March at the earliest. Fed views is mid-year. But I don't know. I mean, it might depend on how the market does between now and the next Fed meeting in 9 days. If it just keeps puking every day, then maybe they'll have reason to end it. If there's some renewed strength between now and then uh, perhaps they would try to kick the can down the road a little bit longer. When will Bitcoin have a bear market low in 2026? Yeah, so cycle theory would state that the next low is going to be near the end of 2026. The main question is will you have a new high between now and then? Tesla. Tesla has had a pretty large drop recently. It's back down to 220, in fact. Um, this is something that I feel like might eventually happen with something like ETH, but um, yeah, I mean, this has honestly been a much steeper decline than I thought it was going to get. My look, guys, I've been pretty clear about my views on Tesla. I don't really I think the highest it will possibly go in the next 2 years would be a little higher than this. Like I don't think it'll go much higher than that. What I've said before is that it's most likely just in a really long consolidation phase, kind of like what happened over here, right? Where it might go a little bit higher than prior highs, which is what it did. Might go a little bit lower, might sweep that low right there. If you get a deep recession, it could always go below that low. But I don't really see Tesla going anywhere in any sustained way until a couple of years from now. And the reason I say that is because I like lived through this consolidation phase, and it was very difficult, like watching it just mostly trend sideways from like 2013 until 2019. Um, I mean, it was worth it in the end, but it was 6 years. So far, this has been 2021 to 2025, so it's been about 4 years. So I'm just sort of thinking, well, you probably have another 2 years of just kind of up and down price action that doesn't really go anywhere great. You know, best case scenario, it just sweeps these prior highs like it did over here. Worst case scenario is it maybe sweeps that low. Um, it could always fall back in here, which is what it did last cycle. You could see that it sort of retested that low. So I've been pretty clear about that for a while, but yeah, I don't know. I don't have strong expectations for Tesla until like 2027, 2028 timeframe. I do own Tesla. I mean, I do own Tesla. I own the stock. I don't own the Tesla car, but what does ETH going home mean? All it meant was going into the regression band, right? It was basically the idea that there is a lower logarithmic regression trend line for Tesla, or sorry, for Ethereum, and going home basically just meant going into the regression band, like it did here, like it did here, and then like it did like right there, and sort of assuming that it would just do the same thing again. So that was what I meant by ETH going home. Home is the lower regression band, whereas sort of where the bull markets that lead to new highs begin from the regression band, right? Look at it in 2015, right? This bull market that led to these highs started from the regression band. The bull market that led to these highs started from the regression band. This bull market here in 2019 during quantitative tightening did not lead to new highs. The rally to new highs did not start until after ETH went down deeper into the regression band. That's the argument, is that you don't get highs until ETH goes home. And that's what it's that's what it's been doing for the last couple of weeks. Make sure you guys subscribe, give the video a thumbs up. And again, we do have the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. So make sure you guys check that out. Looks like we got about 8,000 people watching here. So that's a pretty good number. At least throughout YouTube and Twitter, or X, whatever you want to call it. M2 M2 global lag Bitcoin. How many days is your take? I've seen that before. If it wants to line up with seasonality, I would just say the lag will still go on for a couple more weeks, maybe until April. It could be over as soon as 2 weeks, but I'm just sort of giving a little bit of leeway, you know? I don't know, maybe the market's gonna if you get already to the end of March, the market might wanna wait until the labor market data in April to make a decision. Can I share I don't have any opinion about it. I see you asking this question. Um, yeah, we probably do need some slow mode or anti-spam on. What do I think of Solana and how the abundance of meme coins might impact Solana? I did a video on Sol Bitcoin not too long ago, so I'd check that out. I actually did a couple of videos on it. Do you own a Bitcoin shirt? Well, this is a dubious speculation shirt. Store.inthecryptoverse.com. I'm not saying you should go buy one, but if you don't own a shirt, you could. Sorry, it's kind of hard to keep up with all the questions. Can I show the regression band for Solana? I never created one for Solana. I don't have one for Solana. I guess I could, but I don't have one. CPI 2.9 and then we fly. I think the market right now is just like confused as to whether inflation's coming back or it's not. You know, I mean, it's been going up ever since they started cutting rates in September, but I don't know. I mean, I think that in order to really see the markets get back to a sense of normal, you just need to see inflation, you know, where it needs to be at 2% without having to worry about macro crap continuing. I don't think the Fed's going to raise rates anytime soon. I mean, the next move will probably be a rate cut, would be my base case. But that doesn't mean they're going to cut rates at the next meeting. Right now, Bitcoin's actually slowly inching up. It's up 1% on the day. So it's right under 80K right now. Just under 80K. Another March Madness bracket challenge coming. Yeah, we'll do that again. That's always fun to do. Litecoin thoughts? In general, Litecoin just bleeds against Bitcoin. Occasionally it gets a rally to a lower high, but it's just a bleeder. 1970s comparison for inflation to today. I'm not that pessimistic about inflation. I really think Powell is going to get it under control, but I could be wrong. And if I see the signs that it's truly accelerating, then I'll try to let you know as soon as I see it. But I'm still optimistic that we're not going to have a major secondary wave. It doesn't mean it can't happen, but base case right now is that it doesn't. But we'll see. All right, guys. I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up. We do have the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothe.cryptoverse.com. So make sure you guys check that out. Right now, Bitcoin's at around 79K. ETH is below 1900. We'll see what the stock market does tomorrow. It's usually when the stock market opens that drags Bitcoin down. So watch tomorrow on the stock market open. We'll see what happens if it has the same effect on Bitcoin or not. But those are sort of the main talking points right now. Hopefully these views have been helpful for you guys. We'll go ahead and wrap it up. Subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.